Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into a world that feels both impossibly far away and strangely familiar. Imagine a little village somewhere in Europe, tucked between rolling green hills and the sharp outline of a church tower. The air smells of wood smoke and bread baking, though honestly you probably wouldn't want to eat that bread without some serious dental insurance. The bells are ringing from the church, echoing through the narrow lanes, pulling everyone into a rhythm that isn't marked by your smartwatch or Google Calendar, but by sunrise, sunset, and the toll of bronze. People shuffle to their chores, animals bray and cluck, and you, yes you, step right into this noisy, earthy, slightly smelly scene. And let's be real, you wouldn't last a week here. Forget Uber Eats. Dinner is either in the fields or not happening, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where and when you're listening from. It's always fascinating to know the modern world you're tuning in from while we drift into the past. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the middle of a medieval morning. The first thing that strikes you isn't the scenery, but the soundscape. Cocks crowing, dogs barking, and the church bell dominating everything like the bossy kid in a schoolyard. It's not just to tell the time, it's the heartbeat of the entire community. At dawn, the bell drags farmers out to the fields, apprentices to their masters, and the faithful into pews. Imagine your alarm clock, but instead of a snooze button, you get a priest glaring at you. Cozy, right? Daily rhythms in the Middle Ages weren't about personal choice. The church dictated the calendar, and the seasons decided the rest. When the sun rose, so did you. When it sank, you either went to bed or risked knocking over a candle and burning down half the village. And yes, entire neighborhoods went up in flames because some guy decided to read after dark. Kindle reader? More like kindling reader breakfast? Forget bacon and eggs. If you're lucky, it's a hunk of rye bread so dense you could patch a roof with it, maybe dipped in watered-down ale. Children gnaw at crusts that look like they've been aged longer than fine wine, while adults are already thinking about the long stretch of work ahead. Lunch and dinner weren't much better. Think soups, pottages, and maybe some onion if life was really generous. Meat was rare for peasants. Pigs were more valuable alive than on a plate. Chickens, though, were fair game. That is, if you could catch the sneaky little creatures before they caught you peeking at their eggs. But life wasn't all bleak chewing. There was rhythm and ritual to it that gave meaning. You'd hear the shuffle of feet toward the fields, the scrape of hoes against soil, the rhythmic swish of scythes once harvest season came. Children dart through the lanes chasing each other with sticks. Yes, literal sticks. Who needs Fortnite when you've got a well-shaped branch? And in between the labor, neighbors shared stories, gossip, and the occasional jug of ale passed around like a medieval group chat. No emojis, though, unless you count the carved doodles scratched onto the side of the church pews. Here's the strange thing. As repetitive as it was, there was also structure. You knew what was coming each day, and in a world where life was short and uncertain, that kind of predictability was oddly comforting. But don't mistake that for peace. Behind the rhythm lurked constant threats: crop failure, disease, a tax collector who seemed to enjoy inventing new fees. One week you're saving seeds for planting. The next you're handing them over to some knight who promises protection. And yes, historians still debate whether peasants truly accepted this feudal bargain or just tolerated it, while muttering under their breath, "The smells." Oh, the smells. You walk past a baker's oven and get a whiff of warm bread, but 2 steps later, you're gagging at the open cesspit in the street. People dumped chamber pots straight into the lanes, and pigs wandered happily through the muck like it was their private spa. Medieval villages were basically the original smell-o-vision. It's one thing to picture quaint cottages and smiling faces, but trust me, you'd want to hold your nose, and yet there's a strange charm in it all. Imagine the clang of the blacksmith hammering iron, sparks flying as he shapes nails and horseshoes. The rhythmic sound becomes a kind of background music to your day, like the Spotify playlist you never asked for. Over in another corner, a group of women sit weaving cloth, chatting about who's marrying whom and which neighbor just bought a suspiciously fat cow. Gossip, it seems, never needed Wi-Fi to thrive. Then there's religion, stitched into every second of the routine. You don't just live your life. You live under the watchful eye of saints, relics, and rules. Every festival, every fast day, Every little excuse to ring that church bell made sure you remembered. Even meals were spiritual exercises. Eating fish on Fridays wasn't optional. It was salvation by cod. And you, as a medieval villager, are both weary and oddly comforted by the constant reminders that this daily grind supposedly has eternal meaning. The funny part: despite the strict rhythms, people still found ways to bend the rules. Work on Sunday was forbidden, but that didn't stop peasants from sneaking off to mend tools when the priest wasn't looking. Fasting days often turned into creative recipe contests, anything to convince yourself that eel cooked in too much butter technically wasn't meat. Let's just say, if there were medieval lawyers, they would have specialized in loopholes. By late afternoon, as the sun dips lower, you feel the entire village begin to slow. Tools are set aside, fires are stoked for the evening meal, and people gather together, family, neighbors, sometimes half the street, to share stories. This is when memory is passed down. Someone retells an old legend of Charlemagne. Someone else mutters about the neighbor's field producing better barley than yours. Knowledge, complaints, hopes all tumble into the smoky air. When darkness falls, there's no nightlife in the way we think of it. Forget neon signs or coffee shops. Entertainment is a flickering fire, a lute if someone can play, or maybe a wandering storyteller who's passing through. Then slowly everyone retreats to their beds, often shared, sometimes with animals tucked in nearby for warmth. That's right, you might be spooning with your cow. Romantic, isn't it? And so the daily rhythm of the Middle Ages winds down, simple yet relentless, harsh yet strangely human. It's not glamorous, it's not easy, but it is life, steady, communal, and wrapped in the scent of bread, smoke, and just a hint of manure. You wake the next morning to find that the rhythm of medieval life comes with sharp contrasts. On some days, the village square feels like a banquet hall, food piled high, mugs of ale sloshing, and laughter spilling into the smoky air. On others, the same square is eerily quiet, bellies groaning, with only a pot of watery porridge standing between survival and starvation. Welcome to the feast and famine cycle of the Middle Ages, where your menu is less about choice and more about sheer luck. A feast, when it happened, was glorious. Imagine stepping into the great hall of a manor or castle. Torches flicker against stone walls, shadows dance like drunken jugglers, and the smell of roasted meat fills the air. The tables are long planks set atop barrels covered with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread acting as plates. You tear into venison, goose, or boar, each bite dripping with fat that soaks into the bread below. Later, that soggy bread would be given to the poor. Generosity, sure, but also a clever way to avoid doing the dishes. And then there were the bizarre delicacies. Did you know that jelly-like dishes made of fish or eels were considered sophisticated? Or that peacocks were roasted, then redressed in their feathers to look majestic on the table? Basically the medieval version of Instagram food photography? Historians still debate whether these extravagant displays were meant to impress guests or simply remind them who had more money than sense. The ale flowed freely at these feasts, not because everyone was partying, but because water was usually unsafe to drink. Low-alcohol ale was the medieval Gatorade, chugged by peasants and lords alike. Children drank it too, though don't imagine toddlers stumbling around like tiny drunkards. It was weak stuff, more hydrating than intoxicating. Unless, of course, you kept going after the feast and moved on to the stronger brew. Then things got rowdy fast. Records describe noble banquets, where guests staggered out so sloshed they fell into the moat. Think of it as the medieval version of karaoke gone wrong. But the flip side of these nights of abundance was famine. Crops failed. Weather turned cruel. Grain stores ran low, and suddenly your meals became thinner than your patience. In some years, the Great Famine struck so hard that people boiled nettles, chewed bark, or tried to survive on pottage, so bland it made cardboard look appealing. There are whispers from chroniclers about darker measures too, but let's keep this bedtime friendly and pretend no one ever thought about eating their neighbor's cat. Famine taught creativity, though. One strange survival trick: mixing sawdust into flour to stretch it. Yes, you'd literally be munching on wood. It filled the stomach, even if it wasn't exactly Michelin star cuisine. Other times people resorted to famine bread, made from ground acorns or weeds. Imagine your morning toast tasting like the forest floor. Delicious. The weirdest part is how people interpreted famine. It wasn't just bad weather, it was divine punishment. Too many sins in the village, expect rain at the wrong time, or hail flattening your barley. People gathered to pray, fast, or march in penitential processions, begging for mercy. Of course, if you were already starving, more fasting wasn't exactly helpful. That irony wasn't lost on them, and historians still argue whether these rituals gave hope or just made misery more bearable. Between feast and famine lay the ordinary days, the pottage days. Pottage was the backbone of medieval diets, a thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat you could scrounge up. Every family had a pot simmering over the hearth, and you just keep adding to it day after day. It was like a medieval slow cooker, except instead of chicken chili, you got cabbage mush with a hint of yesterday's onion. Sometimes you'd strike culinary gold. Maybe a neighbor had extra bacon fat to share, or maybe someone caught fish in the stream. Other times, you'd find yourself stirring the pot and praying flavor would appear out of thin air. It rarely did. Still, there's something comforting in the thought. No matter how rich or poor, everyone ate from a pot of something. Feasts also marked the calendar. Saints' days, harvest celebrations, weddings. These weren't just meals. They were community glue. Villagers gathered, sang, danced, and joked. The line between survival and celebration blurred. Picture a farmer who, after 6 months of backbreaking labor, finally bites into a slice of bread dripping with honey. That taste alone might have felt like proof of heaven. And then days later, the honey's gone and you're back to gruel. It's the medieval version of finishing your Netflix trial, glorious while it lasts, and crushing when it's over. There's a fun little fact buried in this rhythm. People often consumed way more calories than we'd expect during feasts. Some records suggest a medieval noble could pack away 5,000 calories in a single banquet, more than an Olympic athlete. But come famine season, peasants might barely scrape by on a 500. Your body would ping-pong between extremes, which explains why medieval skinny wasn't a fashion trend, but an unfortunate necessity. And then there were the uninvited guests, rats. Grain storage attracted them like a medieval buffet. They spread disease, spoiled food, and scurried through kitchens like tiny unwelcome roommates. Picture a noble feast, golden platters, roasted pheasant, dancers twirling, and then out of the corner of your eye a rat dashing across the floor. Congratulations, your glamorous dinner party just got downgraded. By evening, as your stomach either groans with too much meat or aches with too little soup, you feel the strange cycle of medieval life pressing on you. One day abundance, the next scarcity. 1 week wine and song, the next nettle soup and worry. And through it all you realize, hunger shaped not just meals but culture, faith, and community itself. It was never just about eating. It was about surviving, sharing, and sometimes laughing at the absurdity of chewing bark just to stay alive. The night slips into grey light, and once again you're nudged awake not by the sun but by the tolling of bells. Only this time, the sound isn't dragging peasants to the fields. It's pulling monks from their straw pallets into cold stone chapels. It's the hour before dawn, when the air is so damp it clings to your skin like a wet cloak. And you, yes you, are tagging along with men who have sworn their entire lives to prayer. Silence and surprisingly beer. The monastery is alive in its own rhythm, different from the village but just as strict. The monks stir before most of the world, rubbing sleep from their eyes while shuffling into the choir stalls. They chant in Latin, their voices weaving together like a slow river of sound, equal parts soothing and confusing. You don't understand the words, but you feel the weight of them, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Imagine a Spotify playlist labeled Sacred Ambience, 600 AD edition. That's what you're hearing. But here's the twist. As holy as their lives appear, monks were also some of the most practical, hands-on people of the Middle Ages. After prayers, they weren't just meditating. They were brewing. Yep, those solemn figures in robes were masters of beer-making. Water wasn't safe to drink, remember? So monasteries became breweries, producing a safer, tastier alternative. Picture a monk in sandals, stirring a vat of bubbling barley mash with the seriousness of a surgeon. Ora et labora, pray and work, wasn't just a motto, it was a lifestyle. Monastic beer wasn't your casual light lager. Some recipes were hearty enough to count as a meal, packed with grains and nutrients. During fasting periods, when solid food was forbidden, monks could technically drink their way through. It's like giving up food for Lent, but doubling down on protein shakes. Except these protein shakes got you tipsy if you weren't careful. Historians still debate whether the monks truly intended this as a loophole or just happened to discover it. Either way, they perfected brewing techniques that still influence European beer today. And beer wasn't their only craft. As the morning light crept in, monks busied themselves with copying manuscripts, sitting hunched over desks, quills scratching ink onto parchment. Picture the patience it takes to write an entire Bible by hand, while also decorating the margins with little doodles of rabbits jousting. Yes, that actually happened. These men of God got bored too, and slipped in playful art between prayers. Imagine if you were tasked with retyping Wikipedia by hand, and halfway through you added a tiny doodle of SpongeBob in the corner. Same energy. The monastery was also a hub of medicine. In their gardens, monks cultivated herbs for remedies. Chamomile for stomach aches, sage for sore throats, fennel for everything else. They believed the body's health reflected the soul's balance, so their treatments were a mix of science, superstition, and a dash of hope. Picture a monk grinding garlic and honey into a paste while muttering prayers. Was it effective? Sometimes, yes. Other times you might have preferred to just ride out the fever. Still, monasteries preserved ancient medical texts, kept knowledge alive, and occasionally stumbled into real breakthroughs. And then there was food. Unlike peasants gnawing on bark, monks had access to steady supplies from their lands. They grew vegetables, kept fish ponds, and baked bread. But their meals were governed by strict rules: no meat from four-legged animals. Fish was fine, birds were sometimes okay, but beef and pork? Absolutely not. Unless, of course, you got creative. Some monasteries classified beavers as fish because they lived in water. So yes, monks happily roasted beaver tails and declared it spiritually acceptable. Historians still chuckle over that loophole. Daily life followed a tight schedule. Prayer, work, study, prayer, work again. The bell was their boss. Even in the fields, monks plowed, harvested, and milked cows alongside lay brothers. Their work ethic was legendary. If peasants thought they had it rough, monks weren't exactly lounging in silk robes either. Their days blurred into cycles of chanting, labor, and meals in silence. And yet, compared to the uncertainty outside the cloister walls, this life offered stability, safety, and a steady diet of bread, fish, and, of course, the silence of their meals was punctuated not by conversation, but by readings. One monk stood at a lectern reading scripture or sermons, while everyone else chewed quietly. Imagine trying to eat your stew while a voice drones on about the sins of gluttony. Not exactly dinner and a show, but it kept everyone's minds focused, or at least guilty, while they ate. As daylight finally spreads across the cloister, you see the contrast between worlds. Outside, villagers chase pigs, argue at markets, and grumble about taxes. Inside, monks live in a bubble of devotion, discipline, and sometimes loophole-filled beer diets. Both lives are hard, but in different ways. You almost envy the order here, though the lack of Netflix would drive you mad. And somewhere in the rhythm of prayer and brewing, study and gardening, you catch a sense of why monasteries became the intellectual engines of Europe. They preserved books, advanced farming, improved brewing, and offered refuge. Without them, the so-called Dark Ages might have been darker still. The irony: these men who swore off worldly pleasures ended up shaping some of the most lasting parts of daily life. Food, drink, medicine, and books. You can almost picture them chuckling in their cells, knowing that their simple life had ripple effects across centuries. By the time the sun fully climbs the sky, you're ready to slip back outside, leaving the monks to their endless rhythm of ora et labora. You carry with you the sound of chants, the smell of yeast, and the faint image of a doodled rabbit in the margin of a sacred text. Strange, serene, and a little tipsy, just another morning in the Middle Ages. By the time you've shaken the smell of yeast and ink off your cloak, you find yourself drifting into the noise of the marketplace. If the monastery was a world of quiet bells and whispered prayers, the market is its total opposite. Loud, sweaty, chaotic, and bursting with life. Think of it as the medieval version of a shopping mall mixed with a rock concert, minus the food court. Unless you count the guy selling questionable meat pies from a cart. The square is already packed. Merchants from nearby villages have laid out their goods on wooden stalls, bolts of rough-spun cloth, baskets of onions, barrels of salted fish. You hear the bleating of sheep penned up at one end, the cluck of chickens underfoot, and the occasional yelp when one escapes. And then there are the voices, dozens of them, rising and falling in a constant battle of bargaining. Forget Amazon's Buy Now button. Here, every single purchase is a shouting match. You wander past a fishmonger loudly swearing his catch is fresh, though the smell suggests otherwise. A butcher waves a slab of meat that looks like it's been sunbathing for days. Next to him, a woman sells herbs and claims her rosemary can cure headaches, heartbreak, and probably bad breath, if you chew enough of it. Half of these claims are ridiculous, but in a time without Yelp reviews, you just had to trust the seller's loudest pitch. And oh, the rules. Markets weren't just free-for-alls. Town officials often patrolled the stalls, checking weights and measures. If you cheated customers by using a false scale, you might find yourself publicly shamed or fined. In some towns, dishonest bakers were literally dunked in water or paraded around with their bad bread hung around their necks. Imagine walking through Walmart and seeing the bad baker aisle featuring people in stocks. Fair effective, if not exactly subtle. But the market wasn't only about food. This was the social hub of town. Villagers met to gossip about who was courting whom or which noble had raised taxes again. Minstrels played tunes for coins. Jugglers showed off tricks and beggars called out for alms. If you were lucky, a traveling merchant from afar might appear with exotic goods. Spices, silks, even sugar. That's right. Sugar wasn't something you just tossed in your coffee. Say it was a luxury worth showing off. A single lump might be displayed at a feast like a trophy. The chaos also carried its dangers. Pickpockets lurked in the crowd, ready to snatch coins from distracted peasants. Town guards stomped through with their halberds, pretending to keep order, but mostly looking intimidating. And don't forget the ever-present possibility of disease. Crowds and livestock mixed freely, and if you weren't careful, you'd step in something soft and steaming while haggling over turnips. Medieval markets were the original petri dish. Still, there's something exciting about it. The colors, the smells, the voices, all crashing together into a carnival of survival and spectacle. Picture a child tugging at your sleeve, begging for a sweet pastry, while her mother haggles over cheese. Picture a pig breaking loose and charging through the crowd, chased by 3 red-faced men, yelling promises of free bacon if anyone helps. And picture yourself right in the middle of it, realizing this is both chaotic and charming. Like a street festival where everyone forgot deodorant, markets also reflected the odd mix of medieval lore and superstition. Selling goods on Sundays, forbidden unless you were sneaky about it. Certain foods were banned during fasting periods, so butchers had to switch gears. Selling fish, eels, or even beaver tails, still considered acceptable. Yes, the same loophole the monks used. Everyone loved bending the rules when it came to eating. Historians still argue whether these markets represented genuine community spirit or just a glorified tax trap for lords and bishops. And speaking of taxes, don't think you could stroll in, sell your onions and walk away rich. Market tolls were everywhere. Lords and town councils collected fees for using stalls, selling goods, or even entering with a cart. Imagine paying a toll just to stand in the parking lot at Costco. That's medieval commerce for you. By the afternoon, the noise swells into a roar. Jugglers toss knives. Merchants wave hands, buyers argue over the price of wool. Somewhere a priest is yelling about sin, while secretly buying spices for tonight's stew. Children chase each other. Dogs bark and chickens scatter in a feathered panic. The whole square feels like a breathing, shouting, unpredictable creature. And as the sun dips lower, you realize the market is more than just a place to buy food. It's the heartbeat of the community. It's where news spreads, where fortunes are made and lost, where laughter and shouting mix into one messy symphony. It's survival and entertainment rolled into one. Sure, it smells like a barnyard mixed with burnt onions, but it's alive and so are you, swept up in the medieval chaos of the marketplace. As you stagger out of the din of the market, ears still ringing from the haggle chorus, the soundscape shifts again. It's no longer bells or merchants shouting. It's the metallic clash of iron on iron. You follow the echo until you stumble upon an open field near the edge of town where young men in armor are training. Welcome to Night School Medieval Edition. Think less Hogwarts with swords and more boot camp with chainmail. The first thing you notice is the weight. Armor wasn't the sleek Hollywood kind where everyone looks handsome and agile. No, it was heavy, sweaty, and awkward. Thy full suit of plate armor could weigh upwards of 60 pounds, like carrying a kindergartner on your back while trying to sword fight. Knights in training stomp, grunt, and sometimes topple over, just trying to get up from the mud. You can't help but chuckle. It's like watching toddlers learn to walk, except these toddlers are holding deadly weapons. Training wasn't just swinging swords around dramatically. Esquire, the apprentice knight, started young, maybe around 7, serving in a noble household. At first, he learned manners, cleaning armor, and how to serve at table. Essentially, you began your warrior journey by becoming a glorified butler. Only later, as a teenager, did you get to train with weapons, swords, lances, maces, and of course the beloved longbow. Though the English kept that last one as their deadly secret. On the training field, you watch mock battles unfold. Wooden swords crack against shields, splinters flying, while mounted knights practice charging with lances at straw dummies. The horses, surprisingly, are the true athletes here, trained to stay calm amidst chaos, trampling straight lines while their riders wobble on top like clumsy action figures. And don't think riding was all gallantry. Horses were temperamental. A knight might look dashing one moment and be eating dirt the next because his steed decided it preferred grass over combat. And the smell, oh, the smell. Sweat, horse manure, leather soaked with oil. Combine that with the faint aroma of lunch burps under a visor, and you've got yourself a full medieval cologne. Knights often stuffed herbs like lavender into their helmets to mask the odor, but really, nothing covered up the stench of unwashed men in metal suits. If you've ever sat in a crowded gym locker room after football practice, you've got the right idea. But it wasn't all mud and bruises. Knights were drilled in the art of chivalry. Supposedly, they were defenders of the weak, protectors of women, and servants of God. In practice, this often meant memorizing rules about honor while still pillaging peasants on campaign. Historians still debate whether chivalry was an actual code of conduct or just a PR campaign for a violent profession. Whatever it was, young knights recited oaths between bruises, promising to uphold virtues they weren't always great at keeping. Tournaments added a dash of spectacle. You'd see knights practicing for jousts, those dramatic lance duels where 2 men charged each other on horseback, hoping to shatter lances and not spines. Picture NASCAR crashes, but slower and with more armor. Winning brought fame, money, and sometimes the admiration of ladies in the crowd. Losing meant bruises, broken bones, or humiliation. And in case you're wondering, yes, people cheated. Lances could be tampered with, armor weighted, or referees bribed. Medieval sportsmanship wasn't always noble. The training field wasn't all highborn boys either. Squads of foot soldiers practiced nearby, learning how to wield pikes, crossbows, and those terrifying longbows. Archers trained relentlessly, their arms developing so much muscle from drawing heavy bows that skeletons of longbowmen show twisted spines and enlarged bones. Imagine explaining to your medieval chiropractor that your spine looks like a corkscrew because you've been pulling 150-pound bows since puberty. Then there were the tricks of the trade no one wrote down. Want to keep your armor from smelling unbearable? Rub it with vinegar. Want to keep your helmet from fogging up? Line it with wool. And if you're fighting in hot weather, well, good luck. Heat stroke was practically part of the uniform. One chronicler noted that knights sometimes fainted before the fight even began, collapsing under the weight of their gear. You'd look heroic for about 10 minutes, then crumple like a dropped shopping cart. Of course, training wasn't just about combat. A knight also needed to dance, play music, and compose poetry. Yes, poetry. Nothing says warrior of God like a sonnet about your lady's golden hair. You can picture a sweaty knight stumbling off the field, stripping off his armor, and then awkwardly strumming a lute to impress a noblewoman. If Tinder existed back then, his profile would say, likes long rides, good sword fights and rhyming couplets. By late afternoon, you've seen enough bruises, broken lances, and muddy pratfalls to know that being a knight wasn't the glamorous job fairy tales suggest. It was exhausting, expensive, and dangerous. Yet for those who succeeded, it offered a path to wealth, fame, and a place in history books. As the sun sets, knights and squires drag themselves off the field, battered and sore, some laughing, others grumbling. Horses are led back to stables. Armor is stacked in heaps, and the clang of training slowly fades into the evening air. You're left with one thought. Knights may have been the heroes of their age, but most of the time, they were just men trying not to suffocate in tin cans while swinging sticks at each other. You leave the training ground with the clang of metal still buzzing in your ears, and soon the silhouette of stone walls rises against the sky. Their castle looms before you, Not the fairy tale kind from children's books, all neat turrets and shiny banners, but a hulking, drafty fortress alive with its own pulse. If the marketplace was chaos and the training field was sweat, the castle is theatre, politics, pageantry, and plumbing disasters all under one roof. The drawbridge creaks as carts roll in, hauling barrels of ale and sacks of grain. Guards yawn at their posts, spears leaning casually against stone. Inside the gates, the bailey bustles. Blacksmiths hammer horseshoes, servants chase geese, and dogs weave between feet like they own the place. The air is thick with a stew of smells: wood smoke, dung, roasted meat, and something damp and moldy you can't quite identify. Castles were not built for comfort. They were built to withstand sieges. Living in one was a bit like camping forever inside a stone refrigerator. Step into the great hall, and you'll see the beating heart of castle life. Long trestle tables stretch across the room, candles flickering in iron holders, and a fire crackles in the central hearth. Here the lord holds court, hearing complaints about sheep theft or land disputes while trying not to fall asleep in his carved oak chair. Behind him hang bright tapestries, beautiful, yes, but also practical. They helped keep the chill out. Without them, the wind would whistle straight through the walls, turning the hall into a giant draft tunnel. Meals in the great hall were both feast and performance. The lord sat at the high table, elevated so everyone could see him. Think of it as the medieval VIP lounge. Trenchers of meat and bread were served first to the noble family, then to the rest of the hall. Dogs lounged under the tables, waiting for bones to drop, while musicians played lutes or pipes in the background. Etiquette was strict. Don't slurp too loudly, don't pick your teeth with your knife, and for heaven's sake, don't lick your fingers unless you want glares. Not that everyone followed the rules. Chronicles note guests wiping greasy hands on tablecloths or tossing chicken bones onto the rushes on the floor. Martha Stewart would have fainted. But beneath the glamour of banquets, daily castle life had its gritty realities. Servants carried chamber pots up and down spiral stairs, sometimes spilling them. Gravity was not their friend. Latrines, known as garderobes, jutted out from the walls so waste could fall straight down the castle exterior. Romantic, right? On windy days, the smell drifted back in. Some poor servant was tasked with cleaning these shafts, which must have been the medieval equivalent of drawing the short straw. Even nobles weren't immune. Their private facilities weren't much more luxurious. If you imagined a royal throne with silk cushions, adjust your expectations to a wooden bench over a drafty hole. Castles were also noisy places. The clang of weapons from the training yard echoed into the courtyards. Chickens cackled, dogs barked, children shrieked. At night, torches sputtered in the corridors while guards stomped around. Privacy was rare. You shared rooms, sometimes even beds, and the walls were thin enough that gossip traveled faster than smoke. If you wanted a secret, you whispered it in the chapel, or better yet, didn't share it at all. Then there were the defenses. Every castle had them: arrow slits, murder holes, portcullises. Guides will tell you these features terrified attackers, but they also terrified residents. Imagine walking under the main gate while buckets of hot oil hung above, just in case. It kept you alert. And yes, sometimes the oil wasn't actually oil, but boiling water or sand, cheaper, still painful, and less likely to ruin the kitchen budget. Historians debate just how often these defenses were used, but the mere threat was usually enough. Despite the hardships, castles projected power. When you stood in the courtyard, surrounded by stone towers and fluttering banners, you felt the authority of the lord who ruled here. Castles were statements. I own this land, I protect it, and by the way, don't even think about stealing my sheep. They were as much about psychology as military defense. Villagers could look up from their muddy huts and see a fortress that reminded them who was in charge. Yet even lords and ladies longed for comfort. They lined their chambers with furs, built fireplaces in private rooms, and hung elaborate bed curtains to block the cold. By candlelight, nobles might play chess, tell stories, or listen to minstrels. Some even kept exotic pets like monkeys or leopards to impress guests. Imagine showing up to a dinner party and finding a chained leopard in the corner. Talk about conversation starter. Of course, not everything about castle life was glamorous. Food storage was tricky. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled fast, so everything was salted, smoked, or spiced beyond recognition. Wine soured, ale went flat, and bread hardened into edible bricks. Servants did their best to disguise flavors with sauces, but sometimes you just had to chew bravely and pretend you enjoyed it. As night falls, the castle quiets. Torches flicker in the corridors, shadows stretch long, and the lord retreats to his chamber, dogs curled at the foot of the bed. Guards pace the walls, peering into the darkness beyond the moat. Somewhere an owl hoots. You realize castles were never truly still. They breathed with the movement of dozens of lives inside, and as you slip through a narrow spiral staircase, the stones cool under your hand. You can't shake the thought. Castles weren't magical fairy tale palaces. They were messy, smelly, noisy, dangerous fortresses, alive in every sense of the word. You step out of the castle's drafty halls and wander toward the part of town where people go when their bodies ache, when coughs linger, or when an accident with a plow leaves more than just a bruise. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, equal parts herbal remedy, superstition, and outright guesswork. If you thought castles were messy, just wait until you see what passed for healthcare. The doctor you encounter doesn't look much like a doctor at all. He's a barber surgeon, his shop marked by a pole with red and white stripes. Yep, that's where the barber pole tradition comes from. Inside, the smell of herbs mixes with iron and something coppery you'd rather not name. On one side of the room, a chair waits for haircuts. On the other, a collection of knives, saws, and leeches gleam in the candlelight. Imagine walking into your local salon and realizing the stylist is also prepared to amputate your leg. Leeches were a big hit. Got a fever? Out come the leeches. Headache? Leeches on your temples. Bad mood? Leeches again. Though, to be fair, draining a pint of blood might make anyone too woozy to complain. The belief was simple. Your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And illness meant one of them was out of balance. The cure? Remove some fluid until things evened out. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was cutting-edge theory. Historians still debate how effective any of it really was. But let's just say you wouldn't want to catch pneumonia. Not every remedy was terrifying. Herbal medicine thrived, especially among monks and wise women. Lavender for calming, mint for digestion, willow bark for pain relief. In fact, willow bark contains salicin, a chemical cousin of modern aspirin. So while some cures were nonsense, others genuinely worked. You picture a peasant sipping chamomile tea for a stomachache and think, okay, that's not so crazy. Then you remember the same healer might also recommend wearing a toad in a pouch around your neck to cure gout. Less reassuring. Surgery existed, but it was brutal. Anesthetics? Not really. At best, a strong drink and someone to hold you down. Surgeons could set bones, lance boils, and even perform crude amputations. Trepanning, drilling a hole in the skull to release evil spirits, was also a thing. Imagine the scene. No sterile gloves, no anesthesia. Just a man with a chisel and hammer standing over you. Sleep tight, right? And yet not all medieval doctors were hacks. In cities like Salerno or Montpellier, medical schools studied translations of ancient Greek and Arabic texts. Scholars debated Galen's writings, experimented with anatomy, and passed knowledge from east to west. Without them, Europe might have forgotten much of the science preserved during the so-called Dark Ages. But for the average villager, going to the doctor meant hoping your neighbor's cousin's aunt knew a healing charm. Speaking of charms, magic and medicine blended seamlessly. People wore amulets, muttered prayers, and believed certain relics could heal. Pilgrims traveled miles to touch a saint's bone or drink from a holy spring, convinced it could cure blindness or plague. Sometimes faith did help, at least psychologically. Other times, well, if your leg was broken, kissing a relic wasn't going to straighten it. Still, people clung to hope wherever they could find it. Diseases were constant companions. Leprosy terrified entire towns. Lepers were forced to live in isolated colonies, ringing bells to announce their presence. Plague swept in waves, killing so fast that priests barely had time to administer last rites. The Black Death, when it came, was catastrophic. Buboes swelling, fevers raging, communities collapsing. Yet even in ordinary years, measles, dysentery, and fevers took lives. The line between health and sickness was razor thin, and survival often felt like luck. But medicine wasn't all grim. Midwives played vital roles, helping women through childbirth, which was as dangerous as battle. They passed down generations of knowledge, from easing labor pains with herbs to swaddling newborns. Some were celebrated, others accused of witchcraft if things went wrong. Imagine being praised as a miracle worker one day and condemned the next. Stability was not medieval society's strong suit. The funniest part, people sometimes invented remedies that sound almost modern if you squint. Vinegar as an antiseptic, honey for wounds, garlic for infections. And yes, some worked. But then right next to those, you find recipes involving powdered unicorn horn, spoiler usually narwhal tusk, or ground-up emeralds mixed into wine. Picture choking down a gemstone smoothie because your healer swore it cured indigestion. Trendy, yes. Effective? Probably not. By evening, as you leave the healer's shop, the smell of herbs clings to your clothes. You've seen the contradictions. Wisdom and nonsense, compassion and cruelty, faith and fear. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't about certainty. It was about trying everything. Leeches, prayers, herbs, charms, and hoping something stuck. And while you might laugh at the absurdity of wearing a dead toad necklace, you also feel a shiver of respect. These people fought illness with what little they had, stubbornly clinging to life in a world where death was never far away. After the smoke of herbs and the uneasy whisper of leeches fades from your mind, you find yourself pulled into a brighter, noisier scene, one bursting with music, laughter, and the clatter of cups. It's a wedding day in the Middle Ages, and love, if you can call it that, takes on a form that's part celebration, part contract and part chaos. Picture a village square hung with garlands of flowers, children darting around with handfuls of petals, and musicians tuning fiddles and bagpipes. Everyone is invited, because weddings aren't just about the couple, they're about the whole community. This is less private ceremony with carefully curated guest list, and more if you live within hearing distance of the church bell, you're expected to show up. And why not? Free food, free ale, and a chance to gossip about who's marrying whom. The bride wears her best gown, usually the nicest dress she owns, not some tailor-made white confection. The idea of a white wedding dress wouldn't come until much later. For now, color rules red, blue, green, often decorated with ribbons and embroidery. She might carry a wreath of herbs for luck, rosemary for remembrance, dill for fertility. The groom? He's probably in his cleanest tunic, hair combed, face scrubbed, and praying he doesn't spill ale on himself before the vows. The church ceremony is brief, solemn, and surprisingly businesslike. Marriage in the Middle Ages is less about romance and more about property, alliances, and ensuring children are legitimate heirs. The priest asks if both agree, rings may or may not appear, and vows are exchanged. Sometimes it's as simple as the couple declaring consent in front of witnesses, without even stepping into a church. The important part isn't the kiss, it's the legal recognition. Love? Well, that's a nice bonus if it happens. Outside, though, the party erupts. Tables grown with bread, cheese, roasted meats, if the family can afford them, and endless pitchers of ale. Guests cheer, musicians strike up jigs, and dancing begins. The steps are simple. Circles, claps, stomps. Because after a few mugs of ale, no one's pulling off ballet. The bride and groom are pushed into the center, spinning awkwardly while everyone claps along. Imagine a medieval rave, except instead of glow sticks, you've got torches. And instead of EDM, you've got bagpipes squealing like angry geese. And the customs, oh, the customs. One tradition involved escorting the bride and groom to bed, not so subtly ensuring the marriage was consummated. Guests would follow with jokes, songs, and sometimes pranks. Privacy, forget it. It was less honeymoon, more hazing ritual. You picture yourself lying there, sheets pulled to your chin, while your entire village sings bawdy ballads outside the door. Romantic in a very embarrassing way. Marriages weren't always between starry-eyed youths. Sometimes a girl as young as 12 could be married, though consummation was usually delayed until later. Widows remarried, nobles traded daughters like chess pieces to cement alliances, and peasants often married within their own village because traveling 5 miles to meet someone new felt like long distance. Love matches did exist, though. Chronicles tell of couples defying parents or lords to wed out of affection, but such stories were rare enough to make headlines, so to speak. And let's not forget dowries. A bride's family often provided goods, money, land, livestock to sweeten the deal. The more generous the dowry, the better the match. In one village, a cow might seal the bargain. In another, bolts of cloth or a chest of coins. If you were unlucky, your dowry was simply your father muttering, "She can cook stew, take her." Historians still debate how much freedom women actually had in these negotiations, but most agree the system leaned heavily toward economics over emotions. Still, within the formality, there was space for tenderness. Couples exchanged tokens, rings, belts, even spoons. A husband might compose a clumsy poem, or a wife embroider a secret symbol into her husband's shirt. These small gestures whispered of love in a world dominated by duty. You can almost picture the bride sneaking a smile at her groom as they dance, her hand brushing his, just long enough to feel real connection amid the noise. Of course, not every marriage was happy. Domestic disputes were common, and women often bore the brunt of inequality. Divorce was nearly impossible under church law, though separations sometimes occurred. Rumors of affairs swirled in villages just as they do today. The difference? Getting caught could lead to public humiliation, fines or worse. It was a risky game, and most people stuck with grumbling quietly over their cabbage stew instead. By evening, the wedding feast swells into drunken revelry. Guests stagger through dances, someone inevitably tumbles into the ale barrel, and the fiddler plays the same tune for the 15th time. Children doze under tables, dogs gnaw at discarded bones, and torches flicker against the dark sky. The bride and groom sit together, weary but smiling, knowing that tomorrow it's back to chores and routines. But for tonight, at least, they are celebrated. As you watch the crowd sway and laugh, you realize marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't about fairy tale romance or candlelit dinners. It was about survival, alliances, and community. Yet in the middle of all the noise and duty, love sometimes found a way to sneak in, soft and stubborn, like a wildflower pushing through cracks in the stone. Morning mist settles on the road, dampening your cloak and clinging to your boots as you join a long, shuffling line of figures. Pilgrims, hundreds of them, trudge forward with staffs in hand and satchels on their backs. Their sandals slap against mud. Their cloaks smell faintly of smoke from last night's campfires, and the murmur of prayers mixes with the occasional groan of sore feet. Welcome to the Pilgrim's Road, the medieval superhighway for faith, adventure, and sometimes a little fraud. The first thing you notice is how ordinary these travelers are. Peasants in rough wool tunics, nobles in finer cloaks, monks humming psalms, widows clutching rosaries, all mingling together on the same dusty trail. Pilgrimage was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, you walked the same miles. Of course, nobles usually had servants to carry their luggage, which made the equalizer part feel a bit thin. Pilgrims walked to holy sites, shrines, cathedrals, relics of saints, hoping for blessings, miracles, or the forgiveness of sins. Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, Jerusalem. The names rang out like magical destinations. Think of them as the medieval Disneyland. Except instead of meeting Mickey Mouse, you were hoping to touch the bone of a saint and cure your gout. Historians still argue how many went for genuine devotion and how many just wanted a change of scenery and an excuse to avoid taxes for a while. Life on the road was tough. Pilgrims carried little food, maybe bread, cheese, or dried fish, and relied on monasteries, inns, or generous strangers for meals. Water was risky, so ale or wine was preferred even if watered down. You'd sleep in barns, under hedges, or in crowded hostels where fleas and lice came free of charge. Privacy, forget it. You might be spooning with 3 strangers, 2 chickens, and a goat by sunrise. And yet there was joy. Pilgrims sang songs to pass the miles, shared stories, and formed bonds with strangers. Imagine trudging through endless mud, only to have someone strike up a tune about St. James, and suddenly the journey feels lighter. Children laughed at silly rhymes, old women muttered proverbs, and everyone watched the horizon, waiting for the next town, shrine, or miracle. Markets along pilgrim roads adapted to the flow of traffic. Vendors hawked scallop shells, symbols of Santiago, tin badges, and little vials supposedly filled with holy water. Not all were authentic. Some were about as genuine as a knockoff Rolex, but people bought them anyway. Souvenirs, medieval style. You can almost picture the stallholder swearing his badge had definitely touched St. Thomas's shrine, while winking at his neighbor. Hospitals sprang up along these roads too. Not hospitals as we imagine, but places run by monks and nuns offering food, rest, and care. Pilgrims limped in with blistered feet and walked out with patched shoes and renewed hope. Of course, some took advantage. Thieves disguised as pilgrims blended into the crowds preying on the trusting. Town records tell of robberies and even murders along these routes. Pilgrimage wasn't just holy. It was risky. One curious thing, pilgrimage offered a rare form of freedom. A peasant bound to his lord's land could sometimes gain permission to go on pilgrimage, giving him a chance to see the wider world. For many, it was the only travel of their lifetime. You imagine a farmer staring up at the soaring spires of a cathedral in a distant city, mouth open in awe, feeling both small and significant at the same time. And then there were the miracles, or at least the hope of them. Tales spread of blind men gaining sight, cripples walking, barren women conceiving after touching a relic. Some were exaggerated, some invented, but the faith was real. People carried home little tokens from shrines, convinced they held divine power. Even skeptics, trudging back sore and weary, admitted the journey itself felt like a kind of miracle. By evening, the pilgrim road is alive with campfires. The smell of smoke and stew drifts through the air as voices rise in prayer or laughter. A man tells a story of robbers foiled by divine intervention. A woman sings softly to her child, lulling both herself and the baby to sleep. You wrap your cloak tighter and look up at the stars, brighter here without city smoke. And you realize pilgrimage wasn't just about reaching a holy site. It was about the road itself, the friendships, the dangers, the hope stitched into every mile. The pilgrim road narrows, and after days of trudging through mud and prayer, the horizon suddenly changes. Rising above the fields, dwarfing the wooden huts and crooked taverns, you see it, a cathedral under construction. Its half-finished spire pierces the sky like a finger pointing heavenward, wrapped in scaffolding of timber. The air hums with hammering, chiseling, and shouted instructions in half a dozen dialects. You pause, mouth open, because this isn't just a building, it's an act of faith carved into stone. Imagine the effort. Villagers hauling blocks of limestone on carts pulled by oxen. Masons perched precariously on wooden platforms, chiseling intricate saints and demons into portals. Carpenters shaping beams the size of ships. Hundreds of hands, dozens of trades, all united to build something that most of them will never live to see completed. Cathedrals often took generations. Your grandfather laid the foundation, your father raised the walls, and maybe your grandson would see the spire crowned. Building one was like signing up for the world's longest group project, except no one could drop the class. Inside, the space is already awe-inspiring even in its unfinished state. The nave stretches upward, pointed arches directing your gaze heavenward, as if to remind you exactly where to aim your prayers. Light filters through partially completed stained glass windows, throwing colored patterns onto the dusty stone floor. You've seen markets bustling and castles looming, but this space is different. It hushes you even as hammers ring in the background. For it's the medieval equivalent of walking into a concert hall before the orchestra tunes, silence heavy with anticipation. The stained glass itself is magic. Workers melt sand, ash, and minerals, creating panes of blue, red, and green so vibrant they glow even on gray days. Then artisans piece them together into stories. Noah's Ark, saints' miracles, visions of paradise and doom. For a largely illiterate population, these windows were comic books, instruction manuals, and spiritual warnings all in one. People stood, necks craned, trying to decipher lessons from the shimmering light. And yes, some windows hid little jokes, a monkey in a corner, or a mason carving his own face into a saint's beard. Historians still debate whether this was humor, self-advertisement, or a quiet rebellion. Climbing up onto the scaffolding, you feel the danger. Men balance on narrow planks dozens of feet above the ground, hauling stones and tools. One slip and you're gone. Safety harnesses weren't a thing. Deaths happened often, but the work never stopped. Each stone fitted was a prayer. Each chisel strike a defiance of mortality. Funding all this wasn't simple. Bishops preached sermons about the glory of the new cathedral, rattling donation boxes in front of peasants who barely had coins for bread. Wealthy patrons gave land or money, eager to secure their place in heaven, or at least a front-row tomb near the altar. Indulgences were sold, taxes levied, and sometimes indulgence preachers exaggerated a little, promising salvation with the drop of a coin. Picture a medieval Kickstarter campaign. Back this project now and your soul gets premium afterlife access. Cathedrals were more than churches. They were centers of community life, hosting markets in their squares, schools in their cloisters, and even court hearings under their arches. When you entered, You stepped into the beating heart of a medieval city. It wasn't just stone, it was identity, pride, and power made visible. And then there were the bells. Even before the spire was finished, towers rose high enough to hold enormous bells that marked the hours, called the faithful, and sometimes warned of fire or attack. The sound rolled across the countryside, announcing the cathedral's presence for miles. Imagine living in a world where your life was scheduled not by digital alerts, but by the deep toll of bronze. You didn't need a wristwatch. The church itself told you when to work, pray, or sleep. At night, when the workers finally laid down their tools, the skeleton of the cathedral loomed in the moonlight. Shadows stretched across half-built arches, scaffolds creaked in the wind, and torches flickered in the cloisters. It felt both unfinished and eternal, as if heaven itself was slowly lowering a palace onto the earth. You stand there shivering, realizing that this project, this impossible dream of stone, will outlast you, your children, and their children. And yet, in all that grandeur, there's humanity. A mason wipes sweat from his brow and mutters about his aching back. A child sneaks into the site to chase pigeons. A monk prays for safe progress. Lives intertwined in dust and stone, shaping something that would dominate the skyline for centuries. As you drift away, the rising cathedral fades behind you, its spire pointing into the clouds like an unfinished sentence. The road carries you forward, but you can't shake the image. A city straining upward, one stone at a time, determined to touch heaven. The echo of cathedral bells fades as you slip back into the streets, where a different rhythm hums beneath the cobblestones. Not the rhythm of prayer or pilgrim feet, but of trade. The steady clink of coins, the scrape of tools, the chatter of men in aprons. You've stepped into the world of guilds, where bakers, butchers, weavers, and brewers rule their crafts like miniature kingdoms. Forget your modern trade unions. This is medieval networking with a side of intimidation. A guild is more than a club. It's a gatekeeper. Want to sell bread in town? Better be in the Bakers' Guild. Thinking of brewing ale? Join the Brewers' Guild or kiss your beer barrels goodbye. Guilds controlled quality, prices, apprenticeships, and even who got to set up shop. It was the medieval version of membership required, except instead of a Costco card, you needed years of apprenticeship and the approval of grumpy old masters. You watch a young apprentice, barely 13, sweeping flour from the floor of a bakery. His master looms nearby, checking loaves for weight and crust color. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival, and the guild took its responsibility seriously. Sell loaves too light, and you'd face punishment. In some towns, bakers caught cheating had their bread publicly burned, or worse, were dunked in the river, with a basket of their bad loaves tied around their necks. Imagine Yelp reviews, but with actual drowning involved. Brewers were no less strict. The guild inspected ale for strength and purity. Watered-down beer, forbidden. Add strange herbs, risk expulsion. And yet creativity thrived. Alewives, yes, many brewers were women, experimented with recipes, sometimes adding nettles or dandelions for flavor. Picture a woman in a linen cap stirring a vat of frothy ale, her neighbors lining up with jugs, gossiping as they wait. Brewing wasn't just a business. It was community hydration. Historians still argue about whether guild rules protected consumers or just protected profits. But either way, everyone drank the ale. Guilds weren't limited to food. There were weavers, carpenters, blacksmiths, leather workers, and candle makers. Each had its own charter, coat of arms, and strict hierarchy. Apprentices, journeymen, masters. To become a master, you had to present a masterpiece, a perfect example of your craft judged by the guild. Only then could you open your own shop. Imagine Shark Tank, but instead of pitching an app, you're presenting a flawlessly forged horseshoe to a panel of skeptical smiths. But guilds weren't just about business, they shaped city life. They sponsored religious festivals, paid for altars in cathedrals, and paraded through town in matching robes during feast days. Picture a line of butchers marching proudly with banners, while children point and laugh at the bloodstains still on their aprons. It was civic pride mixed with spectacle, and it reminded everyone the guilds had power. Of course, not everyone loved that power. Guild monopolies made it hard for outsiders to compete. Traveling merchants grumbled about steep fees and restrictions. Poor apprentices sometimes worked years without hope of becoming masters, trapped at the bottom of the ladder. And then there were the inevitable scandals, masters accused of cheating, Apprentices caught stealing tools, disputes over territory that sometimes erupted into fistfights in the market. Medieval LinkedIn wasn't always professional. Still, guilds gave security. In a world where famine, war, and plague lurked around every corner, being part of a guild meant protection. If you fell sick, the guild might help your family. If you died, they'd see you buried properly. In some ways, it was an extended family bound not by blood but by craft. You picture a weaver's guild gathering around a widow's home, offering coins and cloth, their solidarity woven as tightly as the fabrics they sold. There were quirks, too. Some guilds held elaborate banquets with rules about who could sit where, how much ale could be poured, and what songs could be sung. Break the rules, and you might pay a fine or have to buy the next round. Imagine a corporate retreat mixed with frat house energy. Others staged plays, acted out biblical stories with enthusiastic and sometimes hilariously unskilled performers. Who needs Netflix when your local candle makers put on a passion play in the town square? By dusk, the guild halls glow with torchlight. Inside, masters argue over bylaws, apprentices scrub floors, and journeymen dream of one day presenting their masterpiece. Outside, townsfolk buy loaves, nails, cloth, and ale, rarely thinking of the rules and politics behind every item. You walk away with the sense that guilds, for all their rigidity, stitched medieval cities together, part business, part brotherhood, part bureaucracy. And as the bells ring once more, calling the town to evening prayers, you can't help but smile. The monks brewed beer for salvation, the brewers brewed beer for profit, and everyone else just wanted a pint. Some things, it seems, never change. The guild hall doors close behind you, their torches dimming into the night. But not far away, a different kind of noise catches your ear. It's lighter, higher-pitched, and far less serious than contracts or masterpieces. You follow the sound of laughter and shrieks until you stumble upon a group of children in a muddy lane, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, playing with whatever scraps the world has tossed their way. Welcome to childhood in the Middle Ages, a mix of danger, delight, and games that would give any modern parent heart palpitations. There are no toy stores here, no neatly packaged plastic sets. Instead, play is improvised. One boy chases another with a stick, swinging it like a sword. Nearby, a girl hurls a leather ball stuffed with rags against a wall, catching it with bare hands. Two smaller children crouch in the dirt, flicking pebbles in a game not unlike marbles. Their laughter rings out, cutting through the smells of smoke and dung that hang in the air. Childhood joy is timeless, even when the toys aren't. Some games are simple, almost familiar. Blind Man's Buff, where a child is blindfolded and must catch the others, sends squealing figures tumbling into fences. Leapfrog has them vaulting over each other's backs, giggling when someone slips into the mud. Antec, well, that one hasn't changed in centuries. You'd recognize it instantly, though here the tagger might be called the wolf chasing lambs through the alleys. Others are less safe. Wrestling matches break out, elbows flying, mud splattering. Boys pick up sticks and smack each other in mock sword fights that occasionally get too real. One ambitious group dares each other to climb onto a pig's back, shrieking as the poor animal bolts, sending them flying into piles of hay. Imagine telling your mom, "I broke my arm because I was jousting with a goose." Not the kind of excuse that earns sympathy. Historians still debate how dangerous these games were, though the broken bones and skeletal remains suggest the answer is very. Sports also crept into their play. In some towns, children kicked balls made of stitched leather, proto-football that sometimes grew into massive brawls involving dozens of players, no rules, and an entire village square. It was less game and more civil war with a ball. Picture your local soccer match, but instead of referees, you've got shopkeepers yelling at kids to stop trampling their vegetable stalls. Girls played too, though often their games mirrored adult roles. They dressed dolls made of cloth scraps, pretended to cook with pebbles and leaves, or sang clapping songs that carried lessons about love, work, and faith. Yet they also joined in with the boys, chasing, tumbling, sometimes wielding sticks with just as much mischief. Childhood wasn't neatly divided, and laughter blurred the lines of gender and class. One odd little pastime, animal games. Children tied strings to beetles or tossed bones like dice, betting on outcomes. Frogs were raced, mice were chased, and sometimes cats were roped into mock hunts, much to the cat's displeasure. It sounds cruel now, but for children in a world of constant hardship, play often sprang from whatever lived, crawled, or scurried nearby. Still, the squeals of delight suggest the fun outweighed the scratches. And then there's the music. A boy produces a reed pipe, squawking out a tune while others clap along. Girls chant rhymes, some nonsense, some carrying scraps of history and legend. Play wasn't just physical. It was oral tradition, imagination woven into rhythm. A rhyme might mock a greedy lord, or recall a saint's miracle, or just serve as an excuse to jump in rhythm until someone collapsed giggling. Of course, not all adults approved. Some saw play as wasted time, better spent working or praying. But others tolerated it, even encouraged it, knowing that joy was as vital as bread. And sometimes adults joined in. Picture a weary father chasing his son through the square, half serious, half smiling, pretending to be the wolf in a game of tag. Even in a harsh world, laughter slipped through. As the sun sinks, you watch the children finally scatter, called home by mothers' voices or tugged away by older siblings. The games end abruptly. No bedtime story or tucked-in sheets, just a hunk of bread, a shared bed with siblings, and dreams filled with running and laughter. Childhood in the Middle Ages wasn't cushioned by safety rails or store-bought toys. It was rough, raw, and improvised, but joy, it seems, needed very little to thrive. And as you drift back into the evening air, you realize those echoes of laughter feel strangely familiar. Swap the sticks for toy lightsabers, the rag balls for soccer balls, and you'd see the same spirit alive today. Children finding magic in mud, mischief in games, and freedom in laughter, no matter the century. The sound of children fades into the quiet rustle of spinning wheels and the steady rhythm of looms. You follow it into a dimly lit room where women bend over their work, hands busy, eyes focused, chatter flowing in between tasks. Here you see another kind of heartbeat, the daily labor of women in the Middle Ages. Forget the fairy tale princesses locked in towers. Most women lived closer to smoke, sweat, and ledgers than to gowns and tiaras. Inside the cottage, two women sit weaving cloth, their fingers pulling threads through frames with practiced speed. The smell of wool hangs heavy in the air, lanolin clinging to everything. A younger girl spins flax into linen, her foot working the wheel in a rhythm as natural as breathing. Around them, children tug at skirts. A pot simmers over the hearth and a baby squalls from a cradle rocked with one hand while the other continues weaving. Multitasking? Medieval women practically invented it. Work wasn't just inside, though. Step outside and you'd find women in fields, bending low to gather herbs, tending vegetable gardens or driving geese toward pasture. At harvest, they joined men swinging sickles, carrying sheaves, threshing grain. Women's labor didn't end when the sun dipped. It blurred into every hour, woven seamlessly with domestic tasks. By dawn, they were baking bread. By dusk, patching clothes. Imagine a job with no clock-out time, no weekends, and no HR department. Just endless lists of chores. And yet women weren't just background laborers. Many managed households as economic units. A widow might run a farm on her own, overseeing workers and making deals at market. Wives of merchants kept accounts, haggled prices, and sometimes ran shops themselves when husbands traveled. In cities, women joined guilds, especially in textiles, brewing, and midwifery. You can picture a woman at her stall in the market, measuring out ale with a sharp tongue, and sharper memory of who still owed her a coin. Of course, society set limits. The law often treated women as dependents of fathers or husbands. Property rights varied. In some regions, widows inherited and thrived, while in others they were pushed aside by male relatives. Marriage contracts spelled out dowries and obligations, tying economics tightly to matrimony. Still, cracks in the system existed. Some noblewomen wielded enormous influence as landholders, regents, or abbesses, commanding more authority than most men dared dream of. Historians still debate just how much ordinary women could push against the rules, but the evidence suggests they found ways. And don't forget midwives. These women carried immense knowledge, guiding mothers through childbirth with herbs, prayers, and sheer endurance. In a world where giving birth was as risky as battle, midwives were lifelines. Yet their power made them targets too. When outcomes went wrong, whispers of witchcraft weren't far behind. One day you were celebrated as a miracle worker. The next, you could be hauled before a judge accused of serving darker forces. Survival once again balanced on a knife's edge. Daily life was laced with small details that reveal women's world. Soap made from lye and animal fat, scrubbed into clothes at riversides. Needles flashing in dim light, mending worn sleeves, herbs strung in rafters, drying for medicine or seasoning, laughter shared over gossip while spinning wool, jokes about neighbors whispered between stitches. If men's world was swords and politics, women's world was thread and fire, and without it nothing held together. And yes, humor lived here too. Fair popular saying mocked lazy men by calling them good for nothing but stirring the pot. Songs teased about husbands too fond of ale, or wives too sharp with their tongues. Even in hardship, women carved out space for wit and resilience. You picture a woman smirking as she folds cloth, muttering under her breath about her husband's great contribution of snoring by the fire. In wealthier households, roles shifted, but work didn't vanish. Noblewomen oversaw estates, organized feasts, directed servants, and stitched elaborate embroidery meant to display status. Some became patrons of churches or artists, their influence etched into stained glass and illuminated manuscripts. Their days weren't spent idly combing golden hair. They were balancing ledgers, arranging marriages, and occasionally maneuvering politics behind the scenes. As night settles, you see a woman bank the fire, tuck children into bed, and finally sit with her spindle, spinning wool by the glow of embers. Her hands never stop, even as her eyelids droop. Women's work, endless and invisible, carried the Middle Ages forward as surely as knights or kings. And though chronicles rarely gave them credit, you can feel it here. The pulse of survival, spun thread by thread, meal by meal, woven quietly into history. The rhythm of women's spinning wheels fades into the open air of the fields, where sunlight glints off scythes and the scent of cut grain drifts heavy and sweet. It's harvest time, a season of back-breaking work, but also of celebration, ritual, and a kind of wild relief. After months of tending crops, fretting over rain and blight, the community now throws itself into reaping. Miss a harvest and you starve. Finish it well and you feast. Picture the fields alive with motion, men swinging scythes in sweeping arcs, women following behind to bundle sheaves, children darting in the stubble to collect stray stalks. The sound is a steady swish-thump, like the earth itself breathing. Sweat soaks tunics, dust sticks to skin, and backs ache from endless bending. Yet laughter bubbles up too, because this is more than labor. It's survival celebrated in real time. Harvest rituals shaped the season. The first sheaf of grain wasn't just food, it was sacred. Some villages decorated it with ribbons, treating it like a spirit of fertility. Others baked it into a massive loaf, parading it through the village before offering it to the church. You can almost see it, a procession of dusty, smiling peasants carrying bread the size of a wagon wheel, priests muttering blessings, children trying to sneak bites when no one's looking. And then came the harvest feast. Once the fields were cleared and barns filled, the village exploded into song and dance. Ale flowed, bread was fresh, meat roasted over open flames. Imagine the relief of sitting down after weeks of toil, biting into a loaf still warm, grease dripping from your fingers, and knowing you wouldn't starve this winter. It was the medieval equivalent of payday, if payday came once a year and determined whether you lived or died. The feasts weren't quiet affairs. Fiddlers scraped, bagpipes wailed, and voices rang out in rough harmony. Dances spiraled across the green, stomping feet kicking up dust. Games returned, tug-of-war with ropes, races through the stubble, even mock battles with sheaves of hay. If someone got a little too drunk and tumbled into the pig pen, well, that was just part of the fun. And yes, records tell us pigs sometimes joined the chaos, squealing in protest as children tried to ride them like donkeys. Strange customs peppered the season. In some regions, the last sheaf cut was shaped into a figure, the corn dolly, a symbol of the harvest spirit. It was kept in homes until spring, then plowed back into the fields to ensure fertility. Others believed leaving a few stalks standing gave thanks to the earth itself. You wonder if these were serious rituals or excuses to add flair to hard work, but either way, they carried meaning. Historians still debate how much of these customs were pagan remnants woven into Christian calendars, but the blending is unmistakable, and not everyone celebrated equally. Lords expected a share, taxes carved out of granaries before peasants could enjoy their fill. The tension always simmered, peasants sweating through fields, nobles swooping in to claim their due. Yet even under the weight of obligation, people still found joy. Singing at the harvest table, They carved out moments of triumph amid the grind. The season also carried its dangers. Sharp tools swung close, accidents happened, and exhaustion left bodies vulnerable. A cut from a scythe untreated could fester. A stumble while carrying a heavy load could break bones. But no one could afford to stop. The harvest had to be finished, and quickly. The weather was fickle, storms threatening to ruin everything. Work fast, celebrate hard, pray for mercy. That was the rhythm. By night, bonfires blazed. Shadows of dancers flickered against the fields. Sparks spiraled into the sky, and songs carried far into the dark. Children dozed on hay bales. Women clapped along, men toasted to health, luck, and future harvests. And above it all, the stars wheeled in silence, indifferent to the toil below. As you sit near the fire, the smell of smoke in your hair, a half-drunk farmer presses a mug of ale into your hand and laughs. Next year may be better, next year may be worse. But tonight we feast, his words linger. The harvest was never just about grain. It was about hope, ritual, and the fragile joy of knowing you'd made it through one more year. The bonfire smoke drifts away as you wander back into the town square, and here the mood shifts from joy to judgment. Where yesterday the space was filled with merchants shouting prices and children chasing pigs, today it's the stage for something more solemn and sometimes more absurd. A crowd gathers buzzing with curiosity because the town court is in session. Welcome to medieval justice, where punishments could be grim, theatrical, or downright ridiculous. At the center, a wooden platform waits. The town officials, dressed in cloaks that lend an air of authority, sit like stern schoolteachers, quills poised to scratch judgments into parchment. Before them stands the accused, a nervous baker, his eyes darting from side to side. His crime? Selling loaves that were too light. In a world where bread meant survival, shortchanging customers wasn't just shady business. It was practically treason against the stomach. The guild already had rules, but the court made sure everyone saw the consequences. The sentence? Not a quiet fine, but public humiliation. The baker is forced to carry his underweight loaves through the square, while children jeer and women laugh behind their hands. In some towns, he'd be tied to a cucking stool and dunked in the river. Imagine a grown man flailing in muddy water, while the crowd howls with glee. Effective? Maybe. Entertaining? Definitely. Historians still debate whether these punishments deterred crime or simply doubled as free community theater. Other cases are more serious. A thief accused of stealing a chicken is brought forward, feathers stuffed into his tunic by mischievous children. The judge listens, nods gravely, and then pronounces the penalty, a whipping in the square. You watch as the thief is lashed, the crowd counting aloud, half shocked and half delighted. Medieval justice was less about rehabilitation and more about making sure everyone else thought twice before pocketing poultry. And then there are the strange trials. A pig accused of killing a child. Believe it or not, animals sometimes stood trial, complete with lawyers and witnesses. The poor beast might be dressed in clothes and paraded before the court, sentenced to hanging or even excommunication. You can almost hear the crowd whispering, half serious, half amused. Justice must be served even to pigs. Trial by ordeal was another favorite. If a case couldn't be decided, divine judgment was invoked. The accused might carry a red-hot iron for a set number of paces, or plunge a hand into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly, God had declared them innocent. If not, well, good luck. It sounds barbaric. But at the time, people genuinely believed justice rested in higher hands. For all its brutality, there was a kind of twisted logic. When humans couldn't decide, let God burn the evidence into your skin. Public executions drew the biggest crowds. A hanging at the gallows was both horror and spectacle. Families came, merchants set up stalls, and preachers thundered sermons about sin. You'd stand shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, clutching your cloak tighter as the condemned climbed the scaffold. The hush, the prayers, the final drop. It was theater laced with dread. Children peeked between their fingers, learning early that crime carried consequences. Yet not all punishments were bloody. Some were designed purely to humiliate. The stocks and pillory stood in many town squares, wooden frames where offenders were locked by the head and hands. Hours passed as passers-by mocked, spat, or tossed rotten vegetables. Imagine scrolling through Twitter and being publicly roasted. Except instead of words, it's literal cabbages to the face. Some culprits laughed it off. Others wept. Either way, the community got its message. Justice also had a curious flexibility. Wealth and status mattered. A noble might pay a fine where a peasant lost a hand. A woman accused of gossiping too loudly could be muzzled with an iron scold's bridle, while a man who drank too much ale might just be scolded and sent home. It wasn't fair, but it was consistent with the hierarchy of the time. The law kept order, but it also reminded everyone of their place. By evening, the square clears. The baker drips river water. The thief nurses his back, and the town settles into quiet again. You feel uneasy, the echoes of punishment lingering in the air. And yet beneath the cruelty you sense a truth. Justice in the Middle Ages was as much about spectacle as it was about law. It wasn't only about punishing the guilty, it was about showing the community what happened when rules were broken. As you leave the square, the pillory stands empty in the twilight, waiting for its next unlucky guest. The silence that follows feels heavier than the laughter that came before. A reminder that survival here wasn't just about food or faith. It was about living under the watchful eyes of both neighbors and judges. The silence of the square doesn't last long. As the sun dips, another sound rises. Lighter, warmer, woven with laughter instead of judgment. Somewhere near the tavern door, a lute strikes its first uncertain chord, and a drum thumps a steady beat. Music spills into the streets like ale from a tipped mug, and suddenly the world feels alive again. Welcome to the world of medieval minstrels, where melodies floated between church bells and market cries, filling the cracks of everyday life. You step closer and see them, a ragtag group of musicians, cloaks patched, boots worn thin from wandering. One plucks a lute, another blows into a pipe that squeals before settling into tune, and a third slaps a hand drum with surprising rhythm. Their audience grows quickly, children wide-eyed, peasants tapping feet, even a weary merchant cracking a smile. Minstrels were the Spotify playlists of the Middle Ages, carrying news, gossip, and entertainment from town to town. No subscription fee, unless you count tossing a coin in their hat. The songs themselves are a mix of everything. Some are epic ballads about heroes and saints, sung in long rolling verses that could last hours. Others are cheeky ditties about tavern brawls, clumsy lovers or greedy landlords. A few are downright bawdy, lyrics about anatomy and ale that make the crowd howl with laughter. You realize with a grin that medieval humor wasn't so different from today's pub jokes. And yes, historians still argue whether bawdy songs were corrupting morals or just keeping spirits alive. Judging by the laughter, you'd bet on the latter. In noble courts, music took on another flavor. Troubadours sang poetry about courtly love, weaving delicate verses to noble ladies. Love from afar, unattainable, noble in its longing. Picture a knight in shiny armor serenading a lady from beneath her tower window, lute in hand, while her husband snored inside. Did anyone really take it seriously? Hard to say, but the poetry lived on. The idea of courtly love may have been more fantasy than reality, but it left a cultural echo still felt in romance today. In taverns, music was less refined but far more fun. The crowd clapped, mugs thudded on tables, and voices joined in rowdy choruses. Imagine Sweet Caroline, but in medieval French or English, and about 3 times as drunk. Instruments squealed, dancers spun, and the line between performance and audience vanished. A minstrel might leap onto a table, balancing precariously as he strummed, while someone shouted for another verse. If you weren't careful, your ale might slosh into your lap mid-song, and the instruments. Flutes, harps, fiddles, drums, bagpipes that wailed like geese being chased. Some minstrels juggled while singing, others trained dogs or monkeys to dance with the music. The entertainment wasn't polished. It was raw, joyful, unpredictable. One song might draw tears with its tale of lost love. The next would have the crowd roaring at a verse about a donkey in a bishop's robes. Medieval audiences didn't want perfection. They wanted life, messy and loud, wrapped in melody. Music wasn't confined to squares and taverns. Churches filled with chants that rolled like waves, structured and solemn, aiming to touch the divine. Cathedrals echoed with choirs, their harmonies lifting prayers toward vaulted ceilings. The difference between sacred and secular music was stark, yet both shaped medieval ears. One soothed the soul, the other loosened the belt. Together, they stitched sound into every corner of life. But minstrels weren't just entertainers. They were also news carriers. A wandering bard might sing of a battle won far away, or a king's new decree, or a scandal involving a noble's affair. In a world without newspapers, songs carried headlines. Of course, accuracy varied. Your news might be wrapped in rhyme and exaggerated for drama. Picture someone learning about a royal wedding through a song that also claimed dragons attended. It wasn't fake news exactly, but it was creative. By night's end, the tavern blazes with energy. Men stomp their boots, women spin in dances that leave skirts swirling, and children doze in corners lulled by rhythm. The minstrels gather their coins, not rich but satisfied, already thinking of the next town where they'll perform. You linger at the edge, smiling, realizing that music here isn't background noise. It's the very breath of community. As you leave, the tune follows you into the dark streets, faint but insistent, like an earworm from centuries ago, and you can't help but hum along, half laughing at yourself. Even in a world of hunger, toil, and judgment, people found reasons to sing and to sing loudly. The tavern's music fades into the night behind you, and in its place you hear the scratch of quills, the low murmur of debate, and the occasional thud of a book being closed with finality. You've stepped into another current of the Middle Ages, one not driven by scythes or lutes but by parchment and ink. Learning, thought to have flickered out in the so-called Dark Ages, is sparking back to life. And you're about to find yourself in the middle of a medieval classroom. Picture it, a drafty hall, benches rough-hewn from oak, students huddled in cloaks to keep warm. At the front, a master paces, lecturing in Latin with dramatic flourishes, as if every syllable is a performance. The students scribble furiously on wax tablets or parchment scraps, though half of them are just doodling marginal dragons when they can't keep up. This is one of the first universities in Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, places that will become legendary. But right now they're chaotic, buzzing hives of eager and sometimes rowdy minds. The curriculum is heavy on the trivium and quadrivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, then arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. If you can argue, count, measure the stars, and sing a little hymn, congratulations, you're an educated man. Later, the brave few venture into medicine, law, or theology, fields demanding years of study. Medicine means memorizing Galen and Hippocrates, law means wrestling with endless canon decrees, and theology means endless debates about the nature of God. For the record, students loved arguing. One historian notes that Parisian debates sometimes grew so heated that punches were thrown. Imagine a philosophy seminar ending in a fistfight, and you've got the picture. Books are rare treasures copied painstakingly by monks, so a single volume might be chained to a desk to prevent theft. Students gather around, peering at pages like it's a sacred relic. Margins are filled with notes, some scholarly, some less so. One surviving manuscript has doodles of knights jousting snails. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, boredom led to doodling. And discipline? Let's just say universities weren't exactly monasteries. Students formed nations, groups based on their homelands, that brawled in taverns, skipped lectures, and occasionally rioted against town authorities. Drunken escapades weren't rare. In fact, they were practically expected. Imagine frat parties, but with more Latin chanting. Professors grumbled, townsfolk complained, and yet learning continued to thrive amid the chaos. The teachers themselves were a mixed bag. Some were inspiring, their lectures filled with wit and insight. Others droned endlessly, earning nicknames like the Snorer from cheeky students. The pay wasn't glamorous, and many professors survived on meager stipends or side jobs. Yet their work preserved and expanded knowledge, connecting Europe back to the classical past and the vibrant scholarship of the Islamic world. Texts from Aristotle, Avicenna, and Averroes flowed into classrooms, sparking debates that reshaped thought for centuries. Women rarely entered these halls, but don't think they were entirely absent from learning. Some convents educated girls in reading, writing, and music. A few remarkable women, Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, became respected authors, philosophers, and scientists in their own right. Still, the majority of university life was male, loud, and soaked in ale. Outside the university, cathedral schools flourished, teaching boys to read scripture and sing chants. Knowledge wasn't confined to dusty halls. It seeped into cities, towns, even marketplaces. A literate clerk kept accounts for merchants. A notary drafted contracts. A scribe recorded chronicles. Learning, once confined to cloisters, now touched the fabric of daily life and the debates. One student stands up, voice rising. Does reason support faith or faith surpass reason? Another counters with Aristotle, another with scripture. And soon the hall is a storm of words. You lean in, half fascinated, half amused, as ideas clash like swords. Sometimes the questions feel absurd. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But beneath the humor lies something real, the rebirth of intellectual curiosity. Historians still argue whether medieval universities were progressive or rigid, but there's no denying they shaped the foundation for the Renaissance to come. As night deepens, you step back out into the cold. Behind you, lamplight glows from windows where students still mutter over books, quills scratching late into the dark. Ahead of you, the road continues, but you carry something new. The hum of thought, the echo of debate, the stubborn flame of learning that refused to die. The classroom's candle smoke fades as you wander down the road again. But this time your feet ache, your stomach growls, and your eyes dart around for a place to rest. Travel in the Middle Ages is no romantic carriage ride. It's mud, danger, and exhaustion. And when the sun dips low, every traveler, whether pilgrim, merchant, or wandering scholar, dreams of the same thing, an inn. The road itself is rough, often little more than a dirt track churned by carts and hooves. Potholes big enough to swallow a wheel lurk in the shadows, and puddles glisten with dubious depth. Travelers walk in groups if they can, wary of bandits lurking in forests. You've heard the tales. A merchant ambushed, goods stolen, body left in a ditch. Bandits weren't the stuff of legend. They were as real as the mud on your boots. That's why every milestone, every town gate feels like salvation. Finally, you see the swinging sign of an inn, often marked with a crude symbol like a boot, a crown, or a stag. Warm light glows from within, smoke curling from the chimney. Relief washes over you. Inside it's cramped, noisy, and smells like wet wool. But it might as well be paradise compared to the cold road outside. The common room is alive. Merchants haggle over ale, pilgrims slump at tables, and a minstrel strums in the corner, hoping for coins. A dog sprawls in front of the fire, tail thumping lazily as boots step around it. The air is thick with the smell of stew, mostly onions, maybe a scrap of meat if you're lucky, and the sharper tang of spilled ale. Your stomach growls, but you also wonder if eating here might shorten your lifespan. Medieval food safety wasn't exactly strict. Still you order. The innkeeper ladles stew into a wooden bowl, sets down a hunk of bread so hard you could use it as a weapon, and sloshes ale into a mug. You taste cautiously. It's bland, watery, but warm. And after a day on the road, warmth is worth more than flavor. The joke among travelers was that if you didn't break a tooth on the bread, you were blessed. Then come sleeping arrangements. Forget private rooms. Most inns offered communal sleeping halls, rows of straw pallets where strangers lay side by side, snoring, coughing, and occasionally stealing your blanket. You crawl onto a lumpy mattress, trying to ignore the smell of damp straw and the scuttling sound of lice and fleas, making themselves at home. Romance novels never mention this part. And yes, if the inn was crowded, you might end up sharing a bed with a complete stranger. Imagine booking a hotel room and discovering it comes with a random roommate who kicks in his sleep. Privacy didn't exist. The walls were thin, the noise constant. Dogs barking, men stumbling back from the ale barrel, arguments flaring in half a dozen languages. Inns were crossroads full of gossip and danger. Deals were struck in whispers over mugs, and travelers sized each other up with cautious eyes. Some innkeepers had a reputation for honesty. Others might rob guests in their sleep. The safer you felt, the higher the price. Stranger still, not all inns were for everyone. Pilgrims often stayed in hospices run by monasteries, simpler but safer. Wealthy nobles might demand private chambers, still drafty but with furs and locks. Ordinary folk, though, got the common hall and the shared straw. You begin to understand why many peasants preferred sleeping in barns or under hedges rather than risk bedbugs and thieves. And yet, inns had their charm. Stories spilled as easily as ale, a soldier bragging about battles fought, a merchant showing off exotic trinkets, a pilgrim recounting miracles. Around the fire you'd hear jokes, songs, and rumors from distant lands. Inns were medieval social media, messy, noisy, and not always reliable, but endlessly entertaining. By dawn, the inn is alive again. Travelers rub sleep from their eyes, pack satchels, and check their purses nervously. Horses are saddled, carts creak back onto the road, and the innkeeper sweeps the floor, already preparing for the next wave of weary feet. You step out into the cold morning air, stiff from bad sleep but grateful for shelter. Travel wasn't easy, but inns stitched the roads together. They were safe harbors in a dangerous world, even if they sometimes felt more like hazards themselves. And as you glance back at the fading glow of the signboard, you realize the Middle Ages were never just about survival. They were about connection, even if that connection came with fleas. The inn fades behind you as winter creeps in, and suddenly the world feels heavier. The air bites at your cheeks, the ground hardens underfoot, and smoke rises from chimneys as families huddle indoors. Seasonal hardships, especially winter, weren't just inconvenient in the Middle Ages. They were the sharp edge of survival. Cold settled into bones like an unwelcome tenant. Houses were little more than wooden frames stuffed with wattle and daub, roofs that leaked, and hearths that smoked more than they warmed. Families clustered around the fire, wrapping themselves in every scrap of cloth they owned. Windows were rare, and if you had them, they weren't glass but oiled parchment that let in a faint glow while keeping drafts only halfway out. You think you've known a drafty apartment, but here it's like living in a permanent wind tunnel. Keeping warm required creativity. People wore layers of wool, slept under piles of furs, and sometimes, yes, shared beds with animals. Cows, pigs, and goats weren't just farm assets. They were heaters. Imagine tucking in beside a cow for warmth, your breath clouding in the dark, the smell less than romantic but the heat undeniable. Families joked that their chickens doubled as feathered hot water bottles. And if you're grimacing, remember, survival trumps comfort. Food was another battle. The harvest feast of autumn now felt like a distant dream. Winter meals shrank into thin pottages, salted fish, dried beans, or bread baked from whatever flour hadn't molded. Salted meat was a treat, but by February, many larders ran bare. People grew inventive. Turnips, cabbages, and whatever root vegetables survived, the frost became staples. The joke was that by March, if you never saw another cabbage again, it would still be too soon. The rich fared better, of course. Lords dined on venison, spices, and imported wines, but even their kitchens groaned under shortages. And servants whispered that no matter how fancy the dishes, nobles still complained of the same problem as peasants. Everything tasted too salty. Salt preserved life, but it also ruined flavor. You can picture a weary noble pushing away yet another salted ham, with the same sigh a modern person might give a microwaved meal. Illness prowled with the cold. Colds, fevers, and winter agues spread easily in cramped huts. Without fresh vegetables, scurvy sometimes struck. Bleeding gums, weakness, a creeping sense of decay. Fires smoked lungs. Damp floors chilled bones, and infections thrived. Children coughed through the night, elders weakened, and midwives worked tirelessly to keep babies alive. Winter wasn't just a season. It was an opponent. Historians still debate how high mortality climbed during these months, but the records make one thing clear. Winter tested everyone. Even daylight seemed cruel. The sun vanished early, leaving evenings long and cold. Families passed the hours by mending clothes, telling stories, or singing softly to keep spirits up. Candles were precious, so most sat in near darkness, the fire casting flickering shadows. It was a time for oral tradition. Legends of saints, local ghost tales, and memories of ancestors passed from mouth to mouth. Entertainment was memory itself, stitched into the crackle of logs. Yet winter also built resilience. Communities relied on each other more closely than ever. Neighbors shared food, lent tools, or bundled together for warmth. Festivals like Christmas and Candlemas broke the gloom with celebration. Greenery hung in halls, fires burned brighter, and villagers sang in defiance of the cold. It wasn't just piety. It was survival through joy, and there were odd little tricks. People believed onions kept sickness at bay if hung by the door. Others swore by strong ale to warm the blood. Some chewed cloves or garlic as protective charms. Whether science or superstition, these rituals gave comfort when medicine had little else to offer. You almost smile, realizing that modern flu remedies aren't always much better. As you trudge through snow-crusted lanes, you see the outlines of huddled cottages glowing faintly with firelight. Inside, families curl together, whispering stories, sharing bowls of thin stew waiting for the thaw. Hardship is everywhere, but so is endurance. The Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles. They were about surviving winters that felt endless. By spring, the frost will break, fields will green, and life will surge back into rhythm. But for now, under the grip of cold, survival is victory enough. And you, wrapped in a thin cloak, suddenly understand why people prayed so fervently. not just for heaven but for a little warmth here on earth. The frost begins to lift, and as the fields slowly awaken, you find yourself leaving the smoky cottages behind and drifting toward a very different world. The road widens, banners flutter, and suddenly you're stepping into the polished, perfumed air of a royal court. Here, life doesn't revolve around muddy boots and salted cabbage. It revolves around glitter, display, and the constant hum of power games. The first thing you notice is the clothing. Nobles strut in gowns and tunics dyed in brilliant hues, deep crimson, rich indigo, glowing green. These colors scream wealth, because the dyes themselves are expensive, imported, and sometimes concocted from things you'd rather not think about, like crushed insects or fermented plants. One lady sweeps past in a gown so wide, she takes up half the hall, a trail of fabric dragging behind her that 3 servants scramble to keep clean. A knight's sleeves droop almost to the floor, lined with fur, more ornamental than useful. You can't help but think if you tried to cook in that outfit, you'd go up like a torch. And then there are the crowns, circlets, and jewelry glittering with gems. Some sparkle, genuinely cut from rare stones. Others are polished glass, meant to dazzle from a distance. You wonder if medieval nobles invented fake it till you make it. But beyond fashion, clothing is armor. Each stitch shouts status, and every guest is silently ranking everyone else by how much cloth, fur, or sparkle they can parade. Court life pulses with ceremony. Servants scurry with platters of delicacies, spiced wine, roasted peacocks, pastries layered with honey. Musicians hover in the background, playing soft melodies while poets prepare verses to flatter the king. And at the center of it all, the monarch, perched on a throne, a living symbol of authority. Every nod, every smile, every frown ripples through the crowd like a stone dropped in water. You realize quickly that survival here isn't about strength in battle. It's about reading the room and knowing when to bow, flatter, or hold your tongue. The games of power are subtle and sharp. A nobleman whispers too close to the king's ear, while another waits his turn, eyes narrowing. A lady drops a casual remark about a rival's ill-tailored gown, and suddenly an alliance falters. Behind the velvet and fur, daggers gleam, not literal ones, though sometimes those too, but daggers of words and favors. Historians still argue how much real influence courtiers held versus how much was for show. But one thing is certain: reputations were made and destroyed in these gilded halls. Entertainment fills the spaces between politics. Jugglers toss knives, jesters caper with sharp tongues, and troubadours sing verses about courtly love, those lofty ideals where knights pine for ladies far above their station. Everyone sighs dramatically, though you suspect most of them are already eyeing someone else across the hall. Courtly love was part poetry, part pretense, and part soap opera. If medieval courts had tabloids, they'd sell out in minutes. Fashion and spectacle sometimes crossed into absurdity. Shoes with toes so long they had to be tied to the knee. Hats shaped like horns or castles. Cardpieces padded to the point of parody. One chronicler noted a duke who wore sleeves so stuffed with padding that he had to walk sideways through doorways. You chuckle, realizing that medieval high fashion was just as ridiculous as any runway today. Except here, you might trip over your own clothes during a royal audience. But beneath the glitter, real responsibilities lurked. Courts were centers of government, charters signed, taxes debated, alliances forged. Kings and queens met with ambassadors, their words weighing more than gold. Messengers hurried in with news from the borders. War, famine, trade disputes, and decisions made here rippled across entire kingdoms. For peasants in the fields, court life might feel like a distant dream, but its outcomes shaped their daily bread. Food at court mirrored its politics, showy, expensive, and often impractical. Platters of swans redressed in feathers, pies filled with live birds that fluttered out when cut, fountains of wine flowing for hours. It wasn't about taste. It was about spectacle. Picture yourself cutting into a pastry only to find doves flying into your face. Impressive? Sure. Convenient? Not so much. And yes, nobles sometimes complained quietly that they preferred simple roasted chicken to peacock feathers in their soup. By evening, the court shifts into dancing. Music swells. Nobles twirl in elaborate steps, careful not to trip on their trains. The king nods, the queen smiles, and everyone pretends harmony reigns. Yet you catch whispers, see glances exchanged, and feel the tension humming beneath the music. Court life is dazzling, exhausting, and never truly safe. As you step back from the glittering hall, the laughter and music still ringing in your ears, you realize the royal court isn't about luxury alone. It's a theater where power wears silk, politics hides in compliments, and survival means knowing how to shine without burning. The glow of the royal court fades behind you, its perfumes and silks dissolving into memory. But as you step back toward the villages, you sense a different energy simmering in the air. Not the polished dance of courtiers, but the raw growl of frustration. Voices rise, tools clang, and the word spreads from cottage to cottage. Peasants are gathering. Tonight, the fields are not just for sowing grain, they're for sowing rebellion. You see them assembling. Men in rough tunics, women with scarves tied tight against the wind, children tagging along because no one can afford to leave them behind. Some carry sticks or pitchforks, others rusty swords pulled from barns. Their eyes are sharp, their jaws set. The cause? Taxes too heavy, rents too high, demands too cruel. Lords build castles, kings throw feasts, bishops collect tithes, and the people who plant the food are left gnawing at cabbage stalks. Enough is enough. The leader is often a charismatic figure, not a noble but a farmer or preacher with words that burn hotter than fire. He shouts about freedom, about fairness, about the right to eat bread they grew with their own hands. The crowd cheers, voices echoing across the night. It's intoxicating, this sudden rush of power. For once, the poor aren't bowing. They're standing tall, fists raised. At first, the revolt feels almost festive. Families march together, banners stitched from old cloth, songs rising like thunder. Some raid manners, smashing locks, seizing grain, even torching tax records. Laughter erupts as parchments curl into flames, centuries of debt erased in smoke. It feels like justice, raw and immediate. You can almost hear someone muttering, "Try taxing ashes, my lord." But rebellion is a dangerous gamble. For every village that cheers, there's a lord sharpening swords. Knights ride out, armored and merciless, trained to scatter mobs with a single charge. Peasants may have numbers, but they lack discipline. Pitchforks bend against steel. Courage falters under hooves. One moment the crowd surges. The next it breaks apart in panic. History's pages are littered with uprisings, crushed before they truly began. The 1381 Peasants' Revolt in England is a famous example. Sparked by brutal taxes and injustice, thousands of peasants stormed London demanding reforms. For a moment they stood in the heart of power, face to face with the king. Promises were made, sweet words of mercy. But once the crowds dispersed, revenge came swift and bloody. Leaders were hunted, hanged, drawn and quartered, their heads displayed as grim warnings. That pattern repeated across Europe. Hope flared, then was stomped out with iron boots, and yet even failure left a mark. Each revolt whispered to the ruling classes, the peasants endure much, but not everything. Fear lingered in noble hearts, forcing small concessions over time. Lighter taxes here, improved conditions there. The peasants rarely won, but their anger carved ripples into the future. Historians still debate whether these uprisings were hopeless spasms of rage or sparks that nudged society toward change. Maybe they were both. The risks weren't only on the battlefield. Entire villages could be punished, fields burned, fines imposed, families scattered. Rumors of spies circulated, trust frayed. Imagine looking at your neighbor across the fire and wondering if he'll betray you to the Lord Steward tomorrow. Courage and fear walked hand in hand. Still, rebellion carried a strange kind of hope. For one night, peasants tasted equality, standing shoulder to shoulder, chanting against injustice. Their tools were clumsy, their victories fleeting, but their voices mattered. Even when silenced, the echoes lingered. As you watch the mob's torches flicker against the dark, smoke rising into the cold air, you feel torn between admiration and dread. The peasants' revolt is both tragedy and defiance, a reminder that beneath the mud and taxes, the human spirit still kicked against its chains. And though most uprisings ended in failure, the message remained. The common folk were not powerless, not completely. By dawn, the torches die, the rebels scatter, and the village looks eerily normal again. But you know the soil is scorched not just by fire, but by the memory of rebellion. Survival might demand obedience, but deep down every field hand knows the truth. They can endure much, but never forever. The castle walls fade behind you, and soon the road opens wide again, stretching farther than any village or manor. Wagons creak under heavy loads, hooves clatter on packed dirt, and merchants call out in a half-dozen tongues. You've stepped onto the veins of the medieval world, the trade routes where goods, stories, and ideas flowed as steadily as any river. Picture the caravan first. Long lines of carts laden with sacks of wool, barrels of wine, bundles of furs. Drivers snap reins, urging oxen forward, while guards ride alongside with wary eyes. Travel here is no leisurely stroll. It's business, risk, and reward wound together. The roads are dangerous, bandits lurking in forests, tolls demanded at bridges, storms threatening to wash everything into ditches. And yet merchants push on because the profits at the journey's end gleam brighter than any fear. At local markets, goods exchange hands quickly. Grain for salt, cheese for cloth, pigs for shoes. But the great routes carried far more exotic treasures. From the Baltic came amber, smooth and golden, glowing like trapped sunlight. From the North Sea ports, wool that clothed half of Europe. From Italy and beyond, spices, pepper, saffron, cinnamon, packed carefully into small sacks worth fortunes. From the East, silk and rare dyes so precious that kings measured them more carefully than gold. Imagine opening a chest filled with cloth so smooth it feels like water, and smelling spices so sharp they make your eyes water. It was wealth you could touch, taste, inhale. Merchants themselves became characters in the story of trade. Some were humble peddlers, trudging from village to village with a pack on their backs. Others commanded fleets of ships or caravans of camels, moving goods across continents. They were storytellers too, bringing news of wars, wonders, and rumors from far-off lands. Her single market day might include tales of elephants in India, pyramids in Egypt, or miracles at shrines across the sea. Not all of it was true, of course, but truth mattered less than the thrill of hearing it. Towns sprang up along these routes like beads on a necklace. Bruges, Venice, Lubeck, centers where trade turned into power. Warehouses lined canals. Ships' masts bristled like forests, and guild halls rang with deals shouted in accents from every corner of Europe. Coins clinked, scales tipped, contracts scratched into parchment-sealed alliances. Money, in its jingling way, built empires as surely as swords. And then there were fairs, huge gatherings where merchants from distant regions met in bursts of color and chaos. Stalls piled high with wares, jugglers entertained crowds, and buyers haggled fiercely. At champagne fairs in France, you could find English wool, Flemish cloth, Italian spices, and German silver, all in one dizzying swirl. Imagine the medieval version of Amazon Prime, except you had to walk there and delivery involved a mule. The sea routes added another layer. Ships hugged coastlines, sails snapping in salty winds, carrying barrels of herring, casks of wine, bolts of silk. Ports became melting pots, their taverns buzzing with sailors swapping curses, songs, and the occasional knife fight. Maritime trade was faster than overland caravans, but storms could sink fortunes in a single night. Somewhere in the depths of the Channel or the Mediterranean lie lost cargoes of spices, silks, and coins, ghostly reminders of risky gambles. Yet trade wasn't just about goods. Ideas slipped along these routes too. Arabic numerals, revolutionary compared to clumsy Roman numbers, spread with merchants. Medical knowledge, astronomy, philosophy, all piggybacked on caravans and ships. A merchant might return not just with saffron, but with a story of scholars debating stars in distant lands. Commerce became culture, and every crate carried a whisper of the wider world. Of course, corruption traveled as well. Toll collectors padded purses, pirates prowled, and counterfeiters stamped fake coins. A smart merchant needed sharp wits, quick feet, and sometimes a strong sword arm. Deals were sealed with handshakes and oaths, but betrayal was always one poorly weighed sack away. By dusk, the caravan halts. Fires spring up by the roadside, smoke rising into the evening sky. Merchants share bread and stew. Guards polish swords and tired oxen chew cud. Voices drift together, Latin, French, Italian, Arabic, blending into a lullaby of trade. You lean back, watching sparks climb into the night, realizing these routes weren't just highways for goods. They were lifelines, stitching together a fractured world with threads of wool, silk, salt, and story. And as you drift onward, you know, the Middle Ages were never as closed as they seemed. Behind castles and cathedrals, roads like these carried the heartbeat of connection, pulsing steadily toward a future of ever greater exchange. The fires of the merchant caravan fade behind you, their warmth replaced by an eerie chill. The road grows quiet, too quiet. Villages stand with doors barred, windows shuttered, church bells tolling not for festivals, but for funerals. You've walked into the plague years, when death itself stalked the land with a swifter step than any army. It begins subtly, a cough, a fever, a swelling in the armpit or groin. Within days, the victim writhes with pain, black blotches blooming across the skin. Whole households collapse. Neighbors whisper pestilence, and suddenly fear spreads faster than the sickness itself. You can feel it in the air, the heaviness of dread, the weight of silence broken only by weeping. Burial pits gape open at the edge of towns, filled with bodies hastily wrapped in sheets. Priests chant prayers over dozens at once, their voices hoarse, their own eyes red with fever. Gravediggers work until their arms tremble, some collapsing into the very graves they dig. Imagine walking past fields where instead of wheat, you see crosses sprouting overnight. It's not a story. It's survival unraveling. The plague carts roll slowly through streets, wheels squeaking, piled with corpses. The air stinks of death, of rot, of smoke from hastily burned belongings. Dogs howl, cats vanish, and even birds seem to keep their distance. Some families lock themselves indoors, barricading windows, praying disease won't seep through cracks. Others flee, into the countryside, into forests, anywhere. But often they carry death with them, unknowingly spreading it further. Medicine falters here. Physicians arrive in long cloaks, faces hidden behind beaked masks stuffed with herbs. They wave sticks to avoid touching patients, mutter about miasmas and prescribe remedies. Bleeding, vinegar, charms that rarely work. Wise women brew potions, monks pray over relics, astrologers point to angry stars. But nothing stops the march of the plague. Historians still argue whether it was spread by fleas, by breath, or both. But at the time, the mystery made it feel like divine punishment. And oh, the desperation. Processions of flagellants wander through towns, whipping their own backs until blood runs, believing their suffering will appease God. Crowds chant hymns, carrying crosses, begging for mercy. Others turn on neighbors, accusing Jews, foreigners, or witches of poisoning wells. Pogroms flare, scapegoats burned, hatred erupting in the cracks of fear. The plague killed not only bodies, but trust, twisting communities against themselves. Yet amid despair, strange fragments of life persist. Children still play in alleys, though their games mimic the death around them. Mothers still hum lullabies, softer now, to comfort sick infants. Lovers sneak glances. Laughter bubbles up at feasts held in defiance, because if tomorrow isn't promised, why not drink today? One priest recorded that people danced in cemeteries, whirling among tombs with wild abandon, as though mocking death itself. The numbers stagger even centuries later. In some regions, a third, even half of the population vanished within a few years. Whole villages stood abandoned, fields untended, churches empty. Silence became the loudest sound. You walk through one such place now, grass growing in streets, doors hanging open, only the wind moving. It feels haunted not by ghosts but by absence itself. But the plague reshaped more than death. It reshaped life. Labor shortages gave peasants leverage to demand better wages. Guilds struggled, but survivors rose to fill gaps. Families reeled, yet inheritance flowed to those left standing, redistributing wealth in strange, uneven ways. Art turned darker. Churches painted skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike, the danse macabre reminding everyone that death was the ultimate equalizer. As night falls, you pass a chapel glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside, a handful of survivors kneel, voices thin but steady, prayers not for victory but for endurance. You stand quietly, feeling the weight of centuries pressing in. The plague years weren't just about loss. They were about humanity stumbling, grieving, adapting, and somehow continuing forward. When you step back into the night, the silence feels less like emptiness and more like defiance. Even in the darkest years, life clung stubbornly to its fragile thread. And you realize, the Middle Ages weren't defined only by death but by survival in spite of it. The echo of plague bells fades, and in its place rises a softer sound. The low hum of prayer, the shuffle of feet on stone floors, the creak of wooden pews. Daily faith. It's not a festival, not a cathedral spectacle, not a desperate cry against pestilence, but a steady pulse woven into every hour of medieval life. You hear it first in the morning. A bell tolls from the church tower, its bronze voice carrying across fields and streets. calling everyone to mark the hour with prayer. Farmers pause, leaning on hoes. Women hush children, crossing themselves. Monks file into chapels to chant. Religion doesn't come once a week here. It shapes every breath, from dawn to dusk. Step inside a parish church and you feel it. Dim light filtering through narrow windows. Candles flickering against painted saints. The scent of wax and incense mingling with damp stone. The priest mutters Latin prayers few understand fully, but the rhythm alone comforts. Villagers kneel on rush-strewn floors, murmuring their own petitions, sometimes for forgiveness, often for rain or for cows to calve safely. The divine feels less distant here, more like a daily neighbor you must keep appeased. Faith doesn't stay within walls. Amulets dangle from necks, crosses, relics, charms kissed before sleep. Travelers whisper a quick prayer to St. Christopher before setting out. Mothers teach children to murmur Ave Maria, as naturally as learning their first words. Meals begin with blessings. Fields are sprinkled with holy water. And even business deals are sealed with oaths invoking God. Imagine living with a pop-up reminder for prayer in every moment of your day, except instead of a phone notification, it's a bell, a blessing, or your neighbor giving you the side-eye if you forget. Monasteries anchor the rhythm. Monks rise in the night for matins. Then lords prime terce, sext, nun, vespers, complin, hours dividing the day with chants. Their devotion spills outward, reminding villagers of the holy cycle ticking alongside their own chores. Nuns too in their convents weave prayer with work, teaching children, brewing medicines, or copying texts while voices lift in harmony. The discipline is relentless, but to them it is breath itself. Yet faith isn't always solemn. Pilgrimages punctuate the year. Holy days lighten burdens. Saints' stories inspire laughter as often as awe. Villagers share tales of miracles, some astonishing, some almost comical. A saint's relic curing toothaches, another saving a cow from drowning, another helping beer ferment properly. Historians still argue which stories people truly believed, but you sense the truth lies in between. Belief wasn't about fact, it was about hope. And faith, like everything, had its shadows. The church collected tithes, 10% of income, no matter how poor you were. Priests sometimes lived more lavishly than their flock. Bishops juggled politics as much as prayers, and indulgences promised salvation in exchange for coin. People muttered, grumbled, sometimes resisted. But even critics rarely abandoned faith itself. They simply sought to make it purer. Faith was too entwined with survival to discard. Every day carried reminders of mortality. A sudden storm, a neighbor's illness, the memory of plague. These pushed people back to prayer. But faith also offered joy. Marriages blessed, children baptized, fields consecrated at sowing. It gave structure to uncertainty, turning chaos into ritual, despair into rhythm. Without it, the world felt terrifyingly empty. As dusk falls, you sit outside a small chapel. Villagers filter out, their faces calm, their worries soothed if only for a night. The priest lingers at the door, offering nods, small jokes, even a smile or two. A child tugs his mother's hand, humming the hymn still echoing in his head. Faith is not thunder here. It is a steady, gentle rain, seeping into soil and soul alike. And you realize daily faith wasn't just belief in God. It was belief in survival, in community, in the fragile but constant hope that tomorrow's sun would rise and the fields would bear fruit again. The parish bells fade into silence, and you notice the horizon itself seems to change. The air carries a different weight, still medieval but stirring, shifting. You've reached the twilight of the Middle Ages, when the old rhythms begin to falter and something new presses at the edges of the world. You walk through a village where cottages look the same, but whispers sound different. Farmers talk not just of rents and weather, but of wages, of choices, of freedom earned in the wake of plague. Towns swell with merchants who count coins as confidently as knights once drew swords. In schools and monasteries, quills scratch not only prayers but experiments, translations, fresh ideas. It feels like dawn creeping in at the very moment the night has not yet ended. Castles still rise, their towers defiant against the sky, but gunpowder rumbles at their foundations. Cannons growl from distant battlefields, making stone walls tremble. Knights still ride in gleaming armor, but muskets and crossbows pierce their pride with brutal efficiency. The old order of chivalry lingers like a song nearly finished, noble but faint. You can almost hear it fading under the drumbeat of change. The church still commands awe, its bells tolling across valleys. But murmurs of doubt spread. Scholars debate. Critics mutter about corruption. Reform stirs beneath the incense. Printing presses creak to life, spreading words faster than priests can silence them. Knowledge, once chained to desks in cloisters, begins to slip loose into the hands of anyone willing to read. And then there's art, suddenly brighter, fuller, more daring. Painters study perspective. Sculptors carve lifelike figures, poets test new voices. Cathedrals still soar. But frescoes now whisper of human beauty as much as divine majesty. You see the seed of the Renaissance pushing through the soil of medieval life, tender yet unstoppable. But don't mistake this twilight for a clean ending. The mud, the hunger, the faith, the laughter, they still fill daily lives. Children still chase ragballs through lanes. Women still spin wool by hearths. Men still gather in taverns to sing off-key songs. The Middle Ages doesn't vanish in a single breath. It lingers, slowly giving way as though history itself is reluctant to wake from a long, strange dream. You stand on a hill as the sun sets, fields stretching wide below. A castle silhouetted in the distance, a church spire catching the last gold of the day. The world feels both old and new at once, balanced on the edge of change. And as the twilight deepens, your own journey through this medieval night reaches its end. Now the voice softens, easing like a lullaby. The torches dim, the chatter fades, and the vivid images blur at their edges. You feel yourself drifting, not through plague or court, not through fields or feasts, but into quiet. The details that once pressed sharp against your senses begin to smooth, like fabric folded gently away. And here, in this fading light, the Middle Ages becomes less a time and more a memory, not just of hardship or survival, but of humanity, singing, laughing, praying, struggling, loving, stumbling, always forward. The centuries slip from your grasp like sand through your fingers, leaving only warmth, only calm. Now breathe slowly. Let the sounds of hammers, bells, and lutes dissolve into silence. Let the torchlight dim until only stars remain. The road, the fields, the castles, they all fade into mist until there is nothing but rest. You are safe. You are warm. You are home. End of script. Sweet dreams.